So thank you so much for joining me, Carol. So, you are a self-described recovering investment banker. You're also an entrepreneur, TV pundit and host, speaker, as well as you comment on economics, business, finance, and you are also a New York Times bestselling author, amongst many other things. But I will be including a full bio so people can get a better sense of what you're all about. But you have a book coming out, and that book is called "You Will Own Nothing: Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back." So obviously, that is a play on the infamous WEF article called "You'll Own Nothing and You'll Be Happy." And it was an article that was making some predictions about 2030. And, it had a lot of controversial connotations for people. I don't think everyone is aware that it's even an article, but I think that'd be a good starting point for us. Is it, I guess clearly it inspired your book. It's clearly a little bit hot. Give us a little bit of a sense of what, inspired the title of your book and how that connects with it.
Yeah. So when you first hear "You'll Own Nothing and You'll Be Happy," and I stumbled into it first through the 2018 video that the World Economic Forum put out with their 8 predictions for 2030, which was input from their global future councils. And as you said, that was inspired originally from an article and whatnot. When I first heard this topic, "You'll own nothing, you'll be happy," you're on Twitter, you're going, yeah, I hear stuff all the time and people get it wrong all the time. It's probably not what it purports to be, because the World Economic Forum is connected with the most elite people in the world, elite business people, elite political folks, elite academics. So how could this group of elite be predicting the end of private property by the end of 2030? So like you alluded to, it didn't really take much research to go in and go, oh no, yeah, that's exactly what they said. And then going back to the article you referenced, and then in the interim, there was also another article called "Can You Rent Everything That You Need in Your Life?" And so one of the things that the World Economic Forum does is they take these ideas and they repackage them and try to get them to stick. And "You'll Own Nothing" certainly stuck, although I don't think people were particularly happy about the concept. And that's the part that struck me as somebody who has spent more than a quarter century trying to help people grow their wealth and harness wealth creation opportunities and seize the American dream. I know that at the foundation of creating wealth is ownership. The way that you create wealth is by owning things, very specifically assets that have the opportunity to at least retain their value, if not appreciate in value. So it was very staggering to me that you would have this group of elite folks going, oh, you're going to not own anything like that. Your path to creating wealth is somehow going to be impaired. And so as I started connecting the dots around a bunch of other things that I'm sure we'll talk about, including a new financial world order, what really occurred to me is that these people who are very smart and well-connected and students of history, and also, have access to all kinds of information, see what is going on, see the changes in the global economic backdrop. And if you're that person, are you going to just go, yeah, well, stuff's shifting. Gee, I hope it works out for me. Or are you going to use all of these resources that you have and proactively try to control all of the resources for your benefit and come out on top? And what a clever way to be able to do that and make sure that you come out on top by telling other people, hey, you're going to be happy if you don't have anything. You're getting that buy-in, that complicitness of, yes, that seems like a great thing. Although, as we know throughout history, when people haven't owned things, they have not only been unfree, they've not only been unhappy, they've probably been miserable. That is, if they survived.
Well, do you think that some of that is because, there's obviously a lot of conspiracy theories around the WEF. And, to me, I just see that as a bunch of really sort of powerful people getting together for a conference. And of course, there's maybe some deals and some groupthink that happens there. And of course, they have some or tremendous influence as to what happens. But, to me, I also think some of this, is it them deciding, well, let's have, as you mentioned, sort of the elites, and I'd love to kind of have you maybe define that word, but also, are they thinking more for me, or are they thinking, well, this is my fantasy of the future where, okay, if people don't have to, for example, own cars, which is where we immediately see this already happening, right? There's ride shares, there's Uber. A lot of people no longer own vehicles, which on the surface might have been an idea that wasn't like a sinister idea. It might have been, well, not everybody can afford vehicles. Maybe not everybody needs one all the time, especially if you live in, say, the downtown core. You might need one every once in a while. But of course, at the same time, there's legitimate concerns about the idea of not owning a vehicle because that means you don't have control over your own movements. So let's touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a ton to unpack there. Certainly, things that start out as good ideas, as we know, often morph into bad ideas. And that's one of the things I talk about in You Will Own Nothing, the different models. I was in a talk and listening to Peter Thiel talk with my friend Alex Epstein, and he kind of put out a good ideas to bad outcomes model, where it started with these people who really believed in things, and then it got co-opted by, he called them racketeers, I call them profiteers, and then they were sort of entrenched by useful idiots. And I sort of take that with the, idea to the return on investment to return on ego, or, right think or wrong think. So, lots of things, saving the planet. Like, we all want to be good stewards of the planet. We don't want to do things that are, going to blow the planet up or, create issues. But that has been, completely co-opted and bastardized in many ways. And so I think that, this idea that there are a group of people who are sitting around who want to do things for the good of humanity sounds like a really great cover story for people to push their ideas. And I do think you're right. The WEF is very much this boondoggle, this connection of, wealthy and connected people that have been able to make deals and improve their own influences by being associated with it. But in many ways, a lot of bad ideas have come out of there, and they've become the useful idiots to bring those back into politics or into the business realm. And I think in some cases that's, very much intentional, because they also get a benefit out of it. And I think there are some people who are affiliated with them that do have this God complex, that they've, achieved so much, and now I'm going to put my imprint on the world. But a lot of it, I think, just comes down to that basic greed, power, and control, and seeing things are shifting and making sure that if they're going to shift, that we're going to help control the shift and put us in the best place possible. And that goes to sort of the other quote unquote conspiracy theory. One of the things I've tried to do in here is bring a lot of tangibility and, quotes and from the horse's mouth and sources and common sense, frankly, to discussions that have started out sounding very conspiratorial. My background is known as somebody who has a lot of common sense. I do have a Wall Street background. I'm not running around with a tinfoil hat. So, I'm trying to let these things speak for themselves. So, one of them, as I alluded to, is this idea that the global financial stakes are shifting and that there is going to be a new financial world order. Like, new world order, that's total conspiracy.
Well, exactly. Immediately, as soon as you were, while that grabs attention, immediately, as soon as you use those words, right, it's almost like detaches people from that, because as soon as anything that sounds conspiratorial, even though you have common sense, because I looked into your background, right, you know what you're talking about. You worked with these Fortune 500 companies. You worked in finance. You have a very solid background. You're not really what I would define as a conspiracy theorist at all. I think you're just using it as a way to talk about these issues. But are you afraid that, or do you have any hesitation about that at all, that it can stop people who are kind of sensible people from even listening? Because some of these issues that get brought up, I bring them up and I think they're very legitimate issues. But as soon as somebody mentions WEF, people sort of stop listening because they immediately go, oh, that person is a conspiracy theorist.
All right. So, and I think it's legitimate. And so I'll tell you about my approach. So, New World Order. Do you think that President Joe Biden is a conspiracy theorist?
Probably not.
Okay, so we all may have very different things we think about President Biden, good or bad. I don't think conspiracy theorist is one of the things that's normally attached to the president.
Sure.
So if you go to the White House's website and you look up Joe Biden's comments on March 21st of 2022 to the Business Roundtable, and the Business Roundtable is the collection of CEOs of all the major U.S. corporations, especially publicly traded corporations, biggest companies in the country. He gave a speech, and in the speech he said, there's and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close. There's going to be a new global economic order. It's something that happens every 3 or 4 generations. There's going to be a new world order out there, quote, and we've got to lead it. So you've got the president of the United States talking about the new world order and talking about leading it. Now, when he talks about that, he's talking to the, again, connected business leaders. So they're the ones that want to lead it. It's not you and me, probably. But he also referenced, the other piece, which, many scholars talk about, is the fact that this happens on a regular basis. The reality is that the U.S. has been the center of the global financial universe with the world's reserve currency for about 80 years. But we haven't always been the center of the financial universe. Before us, it was the British, and before the British, it was the Dutch. And I'm pretty sure, at those point in times, just as we feel very invincible and we've been through, incredible prosperity and we can't really see anything that's different, I'm sure the people of Britain felt the same way. And I'm sure the Dutch felt the same way. Sure. So if you study sort of the rhymes of history, this is something that happens fairly predictably. We are in kind of late stage cycle, and the idea that somehow we're going to buck history and be the center of the financial universe forever, that in itself seems more like a conspiracy theory than the reality. Not to mention that we've seen a lot of shifts happening. We've seen de-dollarization happening, in China, in the Middle East, in the, North African countries. Certainly, obviously, what happened with Russia and some of the sanctions that were put against them as they invaded Ukraine and weaponizing the U.S. dollar and freezing their reserve assets. These are all things that are shifting what's happening globally financially. So when I put it in those terms, and I tell you that this is on the White House's website, and I point you to the history of it, and I tell you about the other people who are talking about this, it doesn't really sound conspiratorial anymore, right? We take it and we give it a lot of context and framework. And that's why I think this book is so important, because a lot of the people who have been talking about this stuff are, in many ways cuckoo. And, it doesn't mean that they're not right some of the time, but their credibility, has been burned or tainted, rightly or wrongly. That's just it. So I'm trying to let the people and speak for themselves. I let the WEF speak for themselves. I let Larry Fink from BlackRock speak for himself. I let the people who are competing with you to buy homes speak for themselves. I'm letting Joe Biden talk about the New World Order. So it's you can't say that's my conspiracy theory. I'm just connecting the dots based on all of the information that's out there. And I have more than 600 sources, many of them which are the NPRs and New York Times and Washington Posts of the world, that I think that most people who might dismiss a conspiracy theory would say, okay, that's kind of hard for me to argue around.
I think that's quite fair. I think facts are really what you want to use. It's hard to argue with those. I mean, some of the things that I've noticed is definitely a consolidation of power and assets. And, you know, you were talking about the U.S. currency, and that is something that may very well be on its way out as the sort of the powerful currency. But also cash, I think, is something that's being phased out. And I saw that accelerated during COVID, you know, sort of under the premise of, you know, it's not safe to use cash. So you saw all these stores not using cash, and that hasn't really changed, even if we're sort of back to normal, quote unquote. So I'm curious, are you concerned about currencies being digitized? Because that seems to be, you know, because everything is now digital. I was even speaking to my parents where they're like, well, everything is, you know, they don't have any printouts even anymore of what their bank account balances are. Everything is online, and that can be changed. And how do they prove that, you know? And I said, well, there might be some kind of a record you can keep track of, but really, how do you know? How do you prove? And also everything is monitored. And even when we're talking about, you know, the big hope was sort of decentralized currencies. And, you know, I have mixed feelings, very, very mixed feelings about those. But at the same time, you know, that a lot of people believe that to be the antidote. But at the same time, you saw the banks and institutions, they took sort of hold of that, because I've noticed, because I tried to buy some just, you know, to experiment with that. And, you know, I couldn't even do that without the permission of my bank. So what are your thoughts on that?
So, you know, obviously the whole idea of digitizing the currency is something that the casinos figured out a long time ago, right? When you take the further away you move from that form factor that you're actually holding, you know, I've got some silver and some copper here, and, you know, like the further away that you move from like these things, the less real it seems. And so the casinos figured that out, right? If you convert to chips, or even better, you put your little card in the slot machine, you get credits, right? Then it doesn't seem like it's real money. It's very different than I'm feeding that dollar out of my pocket. And, you know, the further you move away from that, you know, kind of the less control you have over it. And like you said, you know, as you kind of move through the different iterations of being digital, certainly credit cards and debit cards and peer-to-peer payment systems and all of those kinds of things, digital payment systems, you know, you have less, there's sort of like less opaqueness for you. There's more transparency to other entities about what it is that you're doing, more of a track record. The ultimate concern here is something called a CBDC, or a central bank digital currency. And I don't know if this is something that you and your audience has spent a lot of time with, but basically they're trading off of what you alluded to, Catherine, is sort of this interest in decentralized currency. If you think of Bitcoin or some of these other cryptocurrencies, they came into be that the thesis, the raison d'etre, was that the Federal Reserve and other central banks, along with their governments, couldn't be trusted, that they've been debasing our currency. They've been making, you know, horrible decisions. Our purchasing power is getting killed. They're manipulating it. As I talked about with Russia, they're even weaponizing it at the government level. So wouldn't it be great if we could transact freely in a way that didn't have this middleman? Now, I'm with you. I'm not sure that thesis necessarily is 100% accurate. I'm not arguing that. Like, that's up to the Bitcoin people, but, you know, the thesis there is why there's so much interest in cryptocurrency. What the Federal Reserve and the government have done is gone, oh no, this would threaten us because we want the power. We need to control the money. If we don't control the money, we don't have the power. We can't control the people. This is awful. So let's confuse the ever-living daylights out of them. And let's create a highly centralized currency that we can control. And we'll just tell everybody it's cryptocurrency. And that's basically what they're seeding with the CBDC or a digital dollar, is that they're testing this out and they're already seeding and trying to conflate it and tell people, oh, it's just like cryptocurrency, except it's safe from the government, because, the government makes everything so safe and great for us. And for, the people who are in the know, obviously we know that that's ridiculous and the complete opposite of the decentralized currency. But for a lot of people, it sounds great. So this idea of central bank digital currency, again, let's go back to our cash example because it's the easiest to understand. I've got, my coins or my dollars. I'm going to pay for something. Now imagine that they're microchipped and that the Federal Reserve and the government are monitoring every transaction. And so they know as soon as you scan this exactly what you're doing. And then because they fully control it, they can weigh in and they can go, Carol, I'm sorry. I know you like burgers, but you've eaten far too many this month. Burgers, we potentially think are bad for the environment. So we're just going to shut it down and you can't have that. And if you want to get some, fake meat, then maybe we'll let you do it. Or, Catherine, you said something bad on Facebook or Twitter. We're just going to punish you and you need to go back home today or whatever it is.
And yeah, and that's the thing. I used to be somebody who did think, what are the odds of me ever being somebody who would be on the other side of the government? But these days, it really doesn't take much, right? And we see, and especially with big tech, and that's something I want to talk to you about is, with big tech in particular, they do have, because we rely so much, our whole lives, are so reliant on that ecosystem, right? And because I've talked to so many people who've been cut off from it. So this is happening in a real way. It hasn't happened to me yet, but, I, at this point, I could be very much on that way. And I think of myself as a fairly reasonable person, not particularly radical at all.
There's no room for reason and logic.
There isn't. But I know people whose bank accounts have been cut off. Their banks were shut, often without even an explanation. Their LinkedIn, their Uber, their PayPal. So all of these things that we rely on to be part of society can be at any moment because of sort of wrongthink, right?
Bingo. You are like connecting the dots for me. I love this. It's like, right in the middle here. We saw this, right? We saw this during the Twitter files. We saw this during COVID, that this whole idea of wrongthink and, kind of a very informal social credit that involved cancel culture and just not being on the right side of things has started to creep in. And CBDC does become just one of several ways that can be enforced, but it's the ultimate way because it's the Fed and the government together with complete control, and you've got absolutely no other option. Now, big tech things, we'll come back to that in a second, is an issue, but this is really scary for your freedom and your agency that they can just go ahead and do this. And there are so many easy ways for them to get this entrenched without people even realizing it. I mean, they can say, we're going to do universal basic income, but we can only do it with digital dollars. They can say, we're going to control inflation. Inflation is still out of control. It's eating up your purchasing power. If you do the digital dollar, then we'll have the tool to control it. And you know how they'll control it is because when they don't want you to spend, they'll just shut down everybody's spending. They'll just literally make that a policy. And that will be the way to control inflation because nobody can spend any money. Or, they may do what they did during stimulus and rely on people's ignorance. I'll give you 100 digital dollars, Catherine, if you just give me one of your dollars. And you go, oh my God, I'm going to be a millionaire. This is amazing. Because most people don't understand the debasement of currency and how that works the same way that they wanted their $1,000 of, Biden bucks or Donnie dollars and didn't realize they're paying like $7,000 extra a year for that for the rest of their life because of inflation. So, these are all like very clear ways that they can entrench it and use it as an enforcement mechanism. And I'm with you. Like 10 years ago, if you said to me, Carol, do you really think that this is likely to happen? When, there's possibility, but like, that seems kind of pretty far out there. And then we went through COVID and you can no longer with a straight face go, yeah, that would never happen. Not to mention that, we're getting closer to China every day in terms of our behavior system, and they already have a CBDC and they already have a formalized social credit system. So, there are a lot of things that are happening. Plus, the G7 came out with their combined principles for retail facing CBDCs. And the New York Fed did a major pilot program with lots of financial services institutions. So you don't do those things if that's not something that you're actually actively considering.
Yeah, well, speaking of China, and this is another area where, I didn't think that would happen, but COVID sort of did prove, because, mandates, but also vaccine passports, right? And specifically watching people's behavior in terms of compliance, because, you could argue about all sorts of things around the pandemic, but there are certain things that you could also say very objectively that were compliance behaviors that weren't really warranted, right? Because there was no logic or science behind them. So
I wrote an entire book on this too. So yes, I'm very, very, very much on the forefront of that.
So it really showed that our society is just able to comply, because I think where China's, while we kind of hear about China's social credit and we kind of cringe about it here in the West, we think, oh, this is only something that would happen in China. It's very clear that, they do have a more compliant culture, but it's clear that when we are faced particularly with fear, and I think that was the big factor. People were afraid. And when fear is, and also social kind of pressure, when you kind of divide people into groups and categories, people are willing to sort of go with things. So,
it's even more than that, though, right? It's not just.
Well, you did write a book, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even the pandemic. It's also just, being on the wrong side of, the current thing. It's that wrong thing that you were talking about. Look at what they tried to do to Joe Rogan. Look at what they tried to do to Dave Chappelle. Look what they did to Ellen DeGeneres. You did something that some group of people said is not palatable to us. And they were trying to take away not just their freedoms of expression, but also their financial opportunities, right? Cancel culture is that seed of social credit that then becomes formalized into state-sponsored social credit.
It's the seed of that, but it's one thing to do it to someone else, and it's another thing to be complacent in that being done to you. And so social credit then becomes something where the system turns on you, and you are a compliant part of it. So how does that go from China to us? Because we, I think, are seeing early sort of, or could be seeing early, because I think with something like the vaccine passports in particular, because I know when I looked into it, there was definitely an intention behind it, not a conspiracy theory, because it was literally a program that was launched, if you looked into it, where there were some intentions of doing other things with these passports once they were implemented, for the greater good or whatnot, as was justified
for your convenience. Yes,
for your convenience
and benefit for the children, really.
Yeah. And I guess that's how it starts. But then I remember noticing just a very basic thing, right? I noticed that, well, when I go in with this vaccine passport into a restaurant and I go with someone else, well, now my private information, it wasn't just I had to also show ID. So now my privacy is gone, and the person I'm with, now people can connect us, and I might not want that. And when I spoke out about it, I was called all sorts of things, even though, a few years ago would have been a very reasonable objection. So where are we kind of going with that? And what are the conditions that are allowing for that?
Yeah. So if you think of the vaccine passport in the US, mostly it was an analog form factor. It was this card with some stickers and, somebody at Walgreens drew an X on it or, whatever. If you were in New York, you could get the Excelsior Pass Plus and you could digitize that for your convenience. And in other countries, they obviously took it to the next level with things like QR codes and whatnot. We had that experience traveling in Europe where that, some of this information becomes digitized and you need to get a pass and whatnot. And so they kind of had this form factor because they weren't ready for it. But now you've got all these people who are really just looking to help you. People like, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Facebook and Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and they're coming together with this group that's called ID2020.org to focus on digital IDs. And really, again, it's just for your convenience. That way, you don't have to carry around your analog card or a picture of it. You might lose it, so you can put that card potentially into some digital format. And then where this goes as well. Maybe you just connect your financial information, and just because it would be easier. And once you have a financial, why don't we just put all of your information? Because it would just be easier for you to have this all in one place. And that's how you start getting the technology mechanism to collect this information and this form factor at scale to then implement something that is more like a Chinese social credit system, which, by the way, is still evolving. It's a little bit less evolved, I think, than some people think. It's done on a region by region basis. Each region has different kinds of grades. So it's not like one grade throughout China. Some have letter grades, some have number grades. But the thing is, it's all based on the whim of whatever that region thinks is important. And then they're the ones that get to decide. So like you get good points for doing things like donating blood or going to see your elderly parents or saying nice things about the government on social media. And then you get black marks if you do things like jaywalk or take up too much room on an airplane, which is really annoying. And those people should be punished, but probably not by the government. And, of course, saying bad things about the government. But you can see where that can go wrong.
Well, and some people think that's it's a good thing. Like, for example, if you live in a country like Malaysia, there's these trade-offs, right? You give up your personal freedom, but you have a lot more safety, less crime. You can leave your laptop for a day and probably nobody's going to steal it. So there are people who do advocate. I mean, there's a reason why these things
and listen,
happen, right?
There are plenty of countries around the world where that's, Dubai, I think, is another one of those. And if you want to live in that, type of regime, feel free. But in terms of being the only bastion of individual rights and freedom, and protecting those for, not just ourselves, but for the future generations and frankly for the world, because there's no other, kind of place waiting in the wings to step into that role. It's against every level of freedom. And certainly, while sometimes that works on a niche basis, we have all seen where that goes terribly wrong. And when you give up your freedoms, how quickly that can shift and end up in a really bad position for individuals. So,
and I think it's important to know too that, we do that voluntarily a lot of times for convenience. And one
Correct.
very simple, credit cards. And I'm very guilty of that. It's convenient for me to use my credit card everywhere. I don't use cash very much, and you know what? Everything is tracked by that. And if you disconnect my credit card and there's no more cash, what am I going to do?
And it's something that you really should think about and plan for, from all different. And that's part of the point of this book, is that there are these forces coming at you from all different methods. So like, we don't know, it could be the CBDC, it could be big tech saying, you're on the wrong side of things. There are all these different places where this could end up happening. And so what happens in any of those scenarios? So you have to really empower yourself with the knowledge to be able to think through those particular scenarios and prepare for, if I'm cut off because of A, B, C, or D, like, how am I getting food? How am I paying my rent? How am I, getting the medical care that I need? And then, even a step further, that's kind of the disconnection from your assets. But there's also, like we talked about, the social credits, the cancel culture, people coming after your personal standing, your social standing, which cuts you off from opportunities to gain wealth, and coming after your job. If you didn't get a vaccine, they took away your job, or if you work for a small business that they shut down, they took away your job. So that's actually taking away your ability to make money. So there are all these different kind of ways that they can take away the lead in to make the money, or the money that you've actually accumulated. And again, you need to be prepared and plan for it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's a great segue into, property rights and ownership, and because right now, a lot of people have maybe a bit of cash, maybe some investments on the market. Something like, for example, I thought that land or property would be a good investment, but a lot of people can't afford that because, for example, a lower income family, even like lower income bracket used to be able to afford a house at a certain point. And now you can be upper middle class kind of income level and you can't afford it in most places. So, first of all, I'd love to get a sense of like, why did that happen? And is there a way around that? What does it make sense for people to even invest in these days?
So let me take it from a very specific talking point, because I think this will help to frame it for people. First of all, if you look at millennials, they actually, on an inflation adjusted basis, earn more at age 40 than the boomers did or than Gen X did before them, which I think most people would be surprised by. They would think with, even once you adjust for inflation, that wouldn't be the case. But on inflation adjusted basis, they earn more. But like you said, they have a very little percentage of the wealth. So what happened? And basically what happened is rogue monetary and fiscal policy, particularly on the monetary side. And particularly this is accelerated over the past, call it 13 to 15 years, although, there were things that were done previous to that. But when we came out of the Great Recession financial crisis, we kind of went into this unprecedented historic period of monetary policy. And they artificially suppressed interest rates and printed all of this money out of nowhere. And what that does in the financial markets is it gives corporate investors who have the balance sheets, who can absorb this kind of money, the ability to borrow very cheaply and invest. And when they borrow very cheaply and invest, they invest in assets. There's more dollars chasing the scarce assets, and those assets increase in price. So when everybody told you that there was no inflation from 2007 till 2020, that's totally BS. There was tons of inflation. It was just in assets, and the people who were wealthy and well-connected benefited. So they love that kind of inflation. Meanwhile, savers were getting, no return on their money. Retirees were getting no return on their money. People who were struggling, to pay for things were seeing the value of what they were, buying diminish. So it's very much this, non-merit based inequality gap that's rising. So, out of the Great Recession financial crisis, then you have all of this money. It's inflating different assets. And one area that it ended up going into inflating that had never existed before was single family homes. So you had all of these homes that were foreclosed on and went into short sale because of what happened, prior to the Great Recession that led up to it. But the banks in Wall Street got bailed out. These corporate investors got tons of money, and regular Americans lost their property. And so Wall Street decided, hey, we're going to go in, and these are all great rates, and we're just going to start buying them up. There was no meaningful institutional capital in the single family home market before 2010. End of story. Multiple sources throughout financial media that will tell you this. So then now they said, this is great. We're going to go in. And it's not like they're buying the houses, fixing them up and flipping them. They want to rent you the American dream, where we started this conversation. They want to take a home, which is not only like the physical symbol. When you think about the American dream, right, you think about the house, the owning the house, the white picket fence, right? And so not only is it symbolic, but there's a reason for that. And that's because on a dollar basis, it is the largest asset in most households' wealth. So most household wealth across households is in the home. And so the idea now that you're going to have Wall Street come in with this cheap money that was gotten at your expense, at Main Street's expense, and now they're going to use that to compete with you. And as of last year, about 21% of the homes in this country were purchased by corporate investors. So that's 1 out of every 5 homes that young people are losing out on, because the prices have been inflated because of all of these corporate buyers who are coming in. There's limited supply. And that's at the local level. There's lots of zoning and rules and reasons. They screwed up the labor force, so there isn't enough labor to come and even get these houses built if they want them. There's regulation that adds almost $100,000 a year to the cost of new homes, so on and so on and so on. So of course, people aren't going to be able to afford them because they are now pushing that from Main Street into Wall Street. And so if you're a young person, you're probably saddled with college debt, which we haven't even gotten to part of this discussion. And then, they're loading you up with that with a bad ROI. And now you've got to compete with a corporate buyer that's got, all kinds of money to make a cash offer and isn't even going to go look at the house. They're just like, we don't care. We'll buy it because we're just going to rent it out anyway. This is a really bad turning point in terms of ownership. And so, if you are a young person or you're somebody in a lower income area, you might want to rethink where you live to be able to not be in an area that is so competitive with, some of these corporate buyers. And, potentially there's going to be an entry point here because I think a lot of people also bought property for Airbnbs and things like that maybe haven't panned out. So there may be a window there, and take advantage and get something maybe smaller than you thought, or not in the your number one area, but still that opportunity to get some ownership. Now, I understand it's not perfect ownership because you still have property taxes, but as I said, it is that number one asset across households. And then, you do want to diversify with other things that are tangible. Things like gold, silver, coins like that. If you are in a bracket where you and some other friends maybe can go in on a farm or other productive land, that's a big one. Investing in the stock market, investing in your own business, like whatever it is, and having a diversified portfolio. Because that's the challenge here, is that when we're looking at this broad array of things that are going wrong and these kind of forces coming at us trying to grab our wealth, like we don't know what's going to happen in terms of which one's going to happen first, and we don't know duration. So it could take a year and it could take 25 years, and you have to be prepared for and hedged for either scenario. And so, if I had the timeline perfectly, I'd be on a yacht in the Mediterranean and not on this podcast. It's the hardest thing in finance because you can see the trajectory, and there's so many factors that factor into timing, but you still do need to protect yourself, and you need to get yourself in the habit of thinking about ownership of things, getting away from the frivolous spending that leaves you with nothing, and focusing on the things where you're like, okay, I've spent money, but it's an investment, something that I have and that I can bank on.
So tangible things. And meanwhile, so it's kind of interesting because I have noticed a bit of a trend throughout some of the VCs and things like that, even of buying land, and which is so it speaks to what you're saying. But you mentioned that the Biden administration actually paid farmers not to farm and instead keep the land for conservation. So that kind of stood out for me. And I'm wondering why that is. Like, is there an intentional plan to kind of keep people from owning land?
Yeah, so certainly, in terms of, one of the things I advocate is, these wealthy and well-connected who want you to own nothing, they are not giving up their property. In fact, they are doubling down on things like hard assets. And so really look to what they're doing and not what they're saying. And we are seeing, whether it's, Bill Gates or Harvard University's endowment, all these people who are buying up land and water rights and things like that. So yeah, it is something that you really do need to be thinking about in terms of Biden. So to be fair, this is something that has happened under previous administrations, but he has sort of accelerated it. They want more land for conservation. But if you look at even what's happening in the Netherlands and in Ireland and other areas where they're talking about killing off cattle and not letting the farmers do what they've done historically for the quote unquote good of the climate, even though these same people have waterfront mansions and are flying around on private jets, there is enough real concern to be concerned about the food supply. The WEF, and one of the things I noticed when I was researching the book is that the same names would pop up over and over again. So, people like, oh, the WF's not that powerful. Okay. But like in everything that I researched, they came up, the UN came up, BlackRock came up, it's like at some point it's no longer coincidental. And so they have something in partnership with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, surprise, surprise, called the Food Action Alliance, which is looking to reshape and rethink and reimagine the way that we do everything with food, from the way that we grow it to consume it. And it's like, okay, we didn't need to do this until you guys got involved here. So I do think that just as you're hearing the things about, kind of fake meat and bugs, and it sounds real conspiratorial right now, but as we've kind of seen all of this progress, there's enough real tangible data to say, yes, they are going after this land. It could just be because it's a scarce, good resource. Either way, a good way for you to, if you can, to perhaps own, but also, if you can get a group of people together and, support a farmer and own that land, that might be a good place that if, things go sideways, where you can actually get some food. So I do think we need to be thinking about that. Water is another one that I'm super concerned about, because Wall Street is eyeing that to financialize it. And
more than they already have with bottled water, I guess.
Yeah. So like literally having a market for water and moving it from one place to another based on what they think the highest use is and the value. So that could be, it's not as valuable to grow food. It's much more valuable to fill up a swimming pool in Phoenix. Okay, well, that's great, but then we're not going to have any food, or the food's going to end up being so expensive. So again, these are all just kinds of like seeds of things, just like they did with housing, that we really do need to keep an eye on. And if there's any direct, tangible way for you guys to fight back against that, again, getting with neighbors and groups, and maybe pooling resources, that's another area to think about.
Yeah. And I imagine that not every single suggestion that even the WEF makes is like horrible. Like the crickets, they overfocus on the crickets, even though I will not be caught dead eating one. Or alive, just because of the ick factor alone. I mean, It is protein. People in other countries eat it. I think there's a little bit of too much attention being focused to that and not the things that you've been talking about, or we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about choice, right? Like if you want to eat a cricket, like that's great.
Correct.
Enjoy.
Or fake meat. I don't eat meat.
Yeah, whatever you want, but you need to be able to have that choice, and we can't have people, especially a small group of people, central planning what's good for everyone, because anytime that's ever been done in history, it's been a giant failure. People starve, people die. It's ended in, lots of just massive chaos. So we need to keep an eye on that.
Exactly. And even with meat, even though I'm somebody who's not a meat eater, right? There are people who feel terrible when they don't eat meat. So I wouldn't want anybody to be deprived of that particular choice.
My husband is a meatitarian, so we can't actually go to a restaurant if it's not heavy on the meat.
So, there you go. And I would not want to prevent him from eating his meat. So
no.
It's the people who start yelling. They give people like me a bad name, and I don't want a bad name.
We're all for free choice. If this is good for you,
correct.
You want to do it, you should be able to do it.
Exactly. I'm not here to decide for other people. But speaking of deciding for other people, there's a lot of talk about ESG, and it seemingly came out of nowhere, and people seem to have a hard time understanding why it's even happening, where the benefit is to companies. But companies, big, huge companies, almost every company now have adapted it. They track it. They do it. Advertising companies now track it and even pick where they advertise based on, even the social media platforms where they advertise, they might track it based on their ESG scores. So why, can you explain to me and my audience why that happened and why they go along with it? Like, what's the benefit to them is what I'm really curious about.
So interestingly, ESG is sort of the like bastardized, child of Klaus Schwab of the WEF's initial focus, which is this concept of stakeholder capitalism. And if you think about stakeholder capitalism, here, which means nothing because those two things are diametrically opposed. Capitalism is about ownership, as we talked about, and those are shareholders, people who actually have a vested interest in a company. A stakeholder is just like anybody who wants to impose their whim on a company. So being a stakeholder from the get-go is opposed to this concept of ownership. So if you think about being anti-ownership, he's been pushing this since 1971. He's a very persistent gentleman. And so, he's been really kind of playing around, and ESG has taken on a bunch of different names and has been, found sort of a partner in the UN that's been trying to get it out there with their principles for sustainable investing and other concepts since like the 90s. And so there's really been a long road in terms of building this up. I think the real turning point in my research that I noted was when BlackRock really got involved. And Larry Fink, who is the head of BlackRock, and BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world. They have around 10-ish million of assets under management. Obviously, the market goes up and down. It could be 9 and change or whatever. But at one point, it was it was clocked in at 10 trillion. And so they have just an enormous amount of influence in terms of business in the markets. And he has been entrenched as a partner in the World Economic Forum and, with all these other groups, the UN, that have been trying to push for these ideals. And what I consider ESG to be really is business social credit, that basically a group of people decide these are the things that we want to do today. And so we're going to use money and our influence to bully companies into doing this. And I think that's really what's happened. They sort of, if you look at like the searches for ESG and ESG investing, which I show in the book in terms of charts, they really started to spike as BlackRock started putting out their letters to CEOs and to shareholders about how important ESG was and how they were going to be using their capital to, vote against management teams and boards of directors that didn't follow what it was that they thought was important. And, some conferences that were happening all around at the same time that really started pushing this. That got the Business Roundtable, who we talked about previously, but CEOs of major companies to sign on to this. And I really think, it's sort of like a hostage taking situation. We've seen what these purveyors of capital have been able to do to the fossil fuel industry. We don't like you, so this isn't aligned with what we want to push. So we are going to very actively direct capital away from you. And if you're the CEO of a company, you kind of can't afford that to happen, quite literally. So they just kind of say, well, we just go along with the program, and then, that's kind of managing our risk. We don't have to worry about any of these other things. I've talked to CEOs of public companies, people who are, the lead of ESG or on the ESG team within companies that are both public and private. They've never heard, in many cases, of the World Economic Forum. They don't know where ESG comes from. They can't really define it. They just think it's like one of those weird corporate things that some consultants that they just kind of have to deal with. And they're hoping that they don't have to spend too much time on it, or somebody's convinced them it's a money-making opportunity for them. And so these really harsh ideas that are messing with the capital of this country and frankly, using your capital, through your investments and through your pension funds and retirement funds to then bully companies into making decisions that aren't in the best interest of their shareholders, but are, kind of lined with these political objectives, is just absolute, utter insanity. And so, we've started to see pushback, at the state level and other levels, against this, but it's going to show up in another form because it's too powerful.
Well, is it not getting pushback from the corporations themselves, since it's not a good return on their investment? Or you would think it's not a good
not as much as you might think, because there's that fear of being cast outside of group think. You know, you may get a little bit of that, and we may end up seeing more of that. But the pushback is coming from places like the states and groups who are interested in protecting fiduciary rights more than the companies. And look at how many companies have gotten themselves embroiled in all kinds of insanity that they probably wouldn't have if they didn't feel like there was this kind of threat hanging over them. I
guess it's kind of in the same way that, you know, people don't speak up about ideas. Like, there's so many bad ideas in society right now floating around that most people that I know of all sorts of, you know, ideologies don't agree with, but are completely terrified to speak up, and
lose their jobs. Again, this is like, you know, financial hostage taking. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want there to be backlash. So I'm just going to go along with the program. And even though it may, you know, hurt our returns in the short term, like, at least I'm not losing the biggest investors, the biggest pools of capital long term, because if that happens, then I'm totally screwed. And if I'm outed, what else happens to me? And so, you know, it really is the ultimate bullying tactic. And I think as more people become aware of it, I'm hoping it's one of the things the book will do. I know it will land in the hands of people who right now think ESG is a great thing. And I think that when they start to see where it came from and how it's being used and how it shifts. I mean, Catherine, that's one of the crazy things, is that, you know, what is considered good ESG changes on a whim. I mean, think about Tesla, for example. You know, they got kicked out of one of the ESG indices when Elon Musk decided that he was going to buy Twitter, because they didn't like Elon Musk and his commitment to free speech. So they put fossil fuel companies in there, and they took out the electric vehicle company. And that is, again, business social credit. That's not about any sort of specific ideals. And we've seen Elon call ESG the devil. He actually responded when I talked about this on Twitter directly to me about this, because he has been at the center. He's been, you know, on the wrong side of ESG right think, and he has been punished. It has been used to directly punish his company and all of his shareholders because of that.
Do you think in general these companies, including the tech companies, are they trying to gather just kind of centralized power in the hands of these corporations, or are they lockstep with government, or is it these kind of the Schwabs of the world, or what we call sort of elite Bill Gates types?
I mean, I think that in many ways, you know, a lot of these tech companies are de facto government. I mean, the things that they're doing and the power that they have over speech and our sort of rights, you know, kind of mimic a government. In some cases, they're working, as we saw with social media, via the Twitter files. They're working lockstep with government. In many cases, they have more users than large countries around the world. Some of them have larger market caps than the GDPs of most of the nations in the world. So they are these really powerful entities, and we don't have any sort of, you know, rights like we do with the government, which are already being trampled. But then, you know, in the digital sphere, and you talked about all the people, you know, have been cut off from, you know, what I would consider basic infrastructure. It really is terrifying. And it's a different time for tech, because tech used to be, hey, we're going to, you know, democratize this and give people the ability to use this for more wealth creation. And now it's sort of the opposite. It's cutting people off. You have these, you know, kind of duopolies or oligopolies of just a handful of folks with no competition that are extracting rents, and are just another group that, you know, wants to take your life and, you know, rent it back to you as a service or a subscription.
You know, what's kind of interesting here is that you've got people who on the one hand say, well, we shouldn't have the government interfere in things, including capitalism, right? And on the other hand, you could make the arguments, well, it should be the role of the government to protect our rights and infringement of our rights from these kind of capitalistic entities like big tech and just big industry in general. but it's not really happening enough. In fact, sometimes our rights are being trampled on by government entities. And where do you find that like fine line, I guess, of not interfering sort of with free enterprise, and on the other hand, protecting individuals?
Yeah, so I actually don't think what we have right now is capitalism. We were trending towards cronyism. And if you have a situation like with our mobile phones, which are sort of the gateway to moving in a modern society, you have two companies, two operating systems, the iOS and the Android, which cover more than 99% of the planet, not just the US, worldwide. So you have two choices. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is a free market with lots of choices. That's infrastructure. When we have
someone can make a new one, except it's very difficult when you only have two that are.
Yeah, I mean, it's just fine. And when we get competition, then it becomes a different thing, just like the mobile phone was competition to the phone. But when you have the phone lines, right? Back in the day, there's a law that says, the phone companies can't deny you access to the phone because it's basically infrastructure. So, we can't have this conversation and they go, Carol and Catherine, I don't like what you guys are talking about. So we're just going to pull the phones out of your house. Like they just didn't do that. But very easily, we've seen that happen in, some of the town squares, with payment systems, as you talked about. So in areas where it is sort of a monopoly, duopoly, oligopoly, and it's, kind of an infrastructure, and there isn't this, clear capitalism dynamic, it should be treated like infrastructure. And that's why we do need something like a digital Bill of Rights to codify and protect our natural rights in this new sphere that clearly wasn't imagined, because they are acting as infrastructure. And as I said, in many cases, a de facto government.
Yeah, and I guess in many ways, it doesn't even matter what the motivations are of these, again, quote unquote, elites or the Schwabs,
Right?
Because they may well have good intentions. I don't know. I don't know that they, like, some of them might be very much in their self-interest. Some of them might want to do good in the world, might be misguided. Some of their ideas might even be proved to be good ideas, right? But they think they know better. And they are exacting a tremendous control that's concentrated sort of in the hands of the few. And that's really the problem here. Yeah.
There you go.
So in this kind of, as we head into this potential dystopian future, I guess, what do you think is avoidable at this point, and what might not be? What is it too late when it comes to certain things? And what is it?
All right. So to wrap up our discussion on hopefully a positive note, because I wrote You Will Own Nothing to empower you with knowledge, because you can't come up with a plan to fight back if you don't know where this is all coming from. And you're going to have to treat each of these forces differently. But we definitely want to fight back. I think the realistic way to approach this, because it's very overwhelming when you start thinking about this, like you could really go to a dark place, is like, can you change the fact that there is eventually going to be a new financial world order? No, like this is the reality in history. But there are a couple of things that you can do, right? One is that we can delay it. We talked about duration. I mean, this could be hundreds of years off in the distance if we make some of the right choices. So part of what you need to do is to help push things in that direction, from a community standpoint, to see if we can perhaps delay this. But at a minimum, what you can control is what you're going to do if we end up in this period of chaos and change, because that's the reality, is that if there is a shift, it's not just going to be like one day that we wake up and everything's going to be like, okay, kids, well, we know we used to do it like this, and now we're going to do it like this. Like, this is going to be mass chaos. So this is about giving you the tools so that you can make the behavioral and financial changes and go through that thought process. So like when this happens, you're not surprised and like caught in that state of shock, like what do I do? You've actually been thoughtful about it, and you've been planning for it. And you go, okay, I've come to terms with it. And yes, this sucks, and I wish this wasn't the case, but I'm going to at least make sure, just like those elite want to come out on top, I want to make sure that I'm okay, my family's okay, and my friends and my community members are okay. And so, that is really the message, and hopefully the takeaway here is getting those behavioral changes, including the financial ones, so that when this does start to move, and it's already shifting, but when it starts to move in a different direction, that you're not caught flat-footed.
Well, I think I appreciate the insight very much. It was a really great conversation, and I think some lessons for sure. I think being able to sort of empower oneself is always sort of key, because as much as we talk about the problems, I think it's just as important to talk about some of the solutions and what we can do. And I know your book has a lot of that in it as well. Why don't you share, how we can find you, and when your book comes out, how we can find the book, and I'll also include all of that information as well elsewhere.
Fabulous. So the book is officially out July 18th, but you can pre-order it now and make sure it gets in your hot little hands by the 18th. If you pre-order it now, it's available everywhere. Like, if you want to support big tech, you can go to Amazon. If you want to support a small business, you can go to bookshop.org or your local small business bookseller. And one of the things I'm telling people, this is your first step. Buy the hard copy. Don't buy a Kindle. Don't buy an audiobook. Own something. Like, get in the behavior. Okay, I'm going to actually own a book, and let me see what that's like, and break the cycle. So that's my ask of you, and I guarantee you'll find value. Otherwise, I tend to, while they allow me, although I've been a little bit suppressed in terms of my impressions, but generally speaking, you can find me on Twitter at Carol J.S. Roth. And I've got that handle across other social media, although I don't spend as much time other places. But that's kind of my spiel. I also, write an economic newsletter that I put out, links and stuff on Twitter too. So if the book is, grabs you and you're like, okay, I want to know like what's ahead real time, or explain the banking catastrophes, or, all those things that are happening. I also do that kind of economic connecting of the dots. And one of the things that hopefully came across in this conversation is that I write in a style that takes really big concepts and makes them very accessible. My audiences are from novices to pro, but I break it down. So all of these things that they're trying to make opaque that you don't understand, I want to make sure you do understand that.
It's funny, I was about to say that, because I think the systems have gotten increasingly complex. And that's one of the problems, is that because they're so complex, fewer and fewer people are able to understand them. And in a way that takes advantage of people. That lack of understanding is where people get in trouble a lot.
And it's intentional, by the way, completely intentional. The more opaque it is, the easier it is to exclude you, and for you to just kind of go along with that exclusion. So again, empowering yourself with the knowledge is important here.
I really appreciate you joining me, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Thanks so much for your time. It was fun.